So I'm gonna start with Jay, if that's okay. Let's start first with a broader question about how climate change, global warming moved into government regulation from a question theory in the 50s to a scientific given today. And specifically, can you talk a little bit about the roles of Roger Revelle and Charles David Keeling? And I need to point out here, there's something called the Keeling curve, a measurement of carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa Observatory that this week was at 427.5 parts per million compared to 313 parts per million measured in March 1958 when he began that look. Can you talk about how climate change concerns combined with air pollution regulations led to government responses to carbon dioxide emissions and equivalents over the years, including how early debates about how there was likely a long lead time to deal with carbon reductions changed through those administrations?
Sure. It's a privilege to be here today. I see a lot of friends in the audience, and the panel up here is great. One way to look at this, most of us in school, did you study Galileo and Copernicus? And what they discovered was that the Earth went around the sun. That was a very revolutionary idea, but we learn about them in school. We should be learning in school about Roger Revelle and Dave Keeling, because what they found in the mid-50s was that, contrary to scientific wisdom at the time, that carbon dioxide did not just fall back to the Earth after it was admitted up as a pollutant. In fact, we found out it stays up there for 100 years. And we also found, these two people found out that it was a global pollutant as well. Revelle didn't realize this at first. So that's why I went back and plowed through their papers, because they haven't been digitized and a lot of people don't know who they are. But Revelle was a big deal. He was the chief oceanographer for the Navy during World War II. He was invited to state dinners with Dwight Eisenhower at the White House. And so when he spoke, people listened. So it moved pretty quickly, even into speeches by John Kennedy. This was totally unknown until I found it. I found a letter in Revelle's files from Kennedy's speechwriting office saying, "Thank you for your help." So I said, Kennedy's being advised by the chief climate scientist. So to answer directly Mark's question, we go to a period where it's mentioned as an area of study. So even in the 60s, the Congress is appropriating money. In 2025, we've reached the point where people want to take those down so we don't measure the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we had a hard time getting to strict policy, but we did some of the things right, like develop solar energy because for other reasons. But finally, in recent years, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act, we took some really bold steps. And the politics is very interesting. In the book, I try to deal with both the science and the politics and how it comes up. But by the late 1980s, there's a pretty strong bipartisan group in the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who want to do something about it. But we can't be accused, as some people accuse us of moving too fast. Some people say you're moving too fast. Well, we kind of had the basic science back in 1960. So what took us so long?
So we're sitting here in New Orleans where increased sea level rise caused by global warming, more intense hurricanes, more intense rainfall events are already linked to climate change effects. With the city's present levee systems design, including 15% increase in the height related to those effects over the first 50 years after Katrina, when the levees were rebuilt, and people living outside the levee system seeing dramatic increases now in their flood insurance, likely adding to northward migration decisions. Can you talk a little bit about what is our risk if we don't address climate change? And how are things changing now with the Trump administration's efforts to roll back some of those issues?
Well, I think it's important to note, and this would come as a surprise to most people, that almost all of the risks that we're encountering right now were pretty much in the public record and had been given in congressional testimony by the 1980s. For instance, the drying out of the Colorado River Basin, which is in the news. Well, Revell kind of figured that out in the early 1980s that was going to happen. And it's very instructive because one scientist said, well, we've figured out the storms that are going to be more severe because of global warming. But we can't totally replicate it with computers, so we're not really going to warn you about it. This is part of the hubris of the human nature, sometimes reflected by people we call tech bros. And they think that they know more than nature. So, and there's pressure. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, you understand that scientists don't operate in a vacuum. They're often being kind of nudged. Don't alarm people too much. Even Jimmy Carter got a memo one time, said, we shouldn't discuss about the risk too much till we know what all the solutions will be. Well, that's not terribly honest. So, we've had trouble wrapping our arms around this, and politically, there's been a gap in showing people that their insurance rates are connected to the failure to do something about climate change. So what are the states that are vulnerable to these violent storms? Florida, Louisiana. So those are the leaders in dealing with climate change, right? No, there's a disconnect there. They're not, they're sort of sticking their heads in the sand. So this is worth a longer discussion than we'll probably have time to have today, but something needs to happen because right now there's more digging our heads in the sand than there is taking effective action.
So let me be a bit more direct about this. 2 weeks ago, EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin announced his agency will formally reconsider the government's endangerment finding involving of reducing emissions to coming up with measures to deal with effects. Do you agree with that switch, and what would that mean to the future of coastal populated areas like New Orleans, Miami, New York City?
Well, you're getting my dander up here a little bit. The endangerment was decided by the Supreme Court back in 2007. There was a minority opinion signed by 4 people. There's more people that signed the minority people living than the people that signed the majority. The minority was written by Justice Scalia. Do you remember him? He said, if we regulate carbon dioxide emissions, we will have to regulate airborne frisbees because legally it's hard to distinguish the difference. Now, I don't know who's teaching the law school courses that are spinning off these legal theories, but they're out there and we have to deal with them. Obviously, there is no doubt that there is endangerment from the climate change. And furthermore, the tech bros, they say we can adjust to this. Well, the world has what, 8, 9 billion people? Maybe we can, maybe we have the money to fortify our roof or do something. But since we're the leading country per capita in pollution, don't we have some obligation to those people? And does Zeldin have a plan of how those people are going to adapt to this endangerment? I think it's Bill McKibben, who Trish knows. I've never met him, but he wrote a book, The End of Nature, and he said this is a test of the human animal. This whole question is a test. And Wally Brooker, another one of the great climate scientists that I deal with in my book, he said the same thing before he died. He said, we will, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, they will look back at us and judge our wisdom as humans. I think it's pretty impossible that we would get an A or a B. But we are doing some good things in solar energy. I don't want to be a downer here because solar energy combined with batteries and advanced technical controls, can do a lot of things. So if we electrify, use solar and batteries, we now can say cleaner is cheaper. Cheaper is cleaner. So I'm not being totally down, but I'm saying the human animal so far has a way to go to get a good grade on how we're dealing with this issue.
How did you move from human rights investigative journalist and activist to education and birding? And can you talk about the role of New Orleans in that movement?
Sure, Mark. First of all, I just want to say how honored I am to be here at this invitation. And when I tell you a little of the story, you'll understand why it's such an honor. I'm going to cry. Anyway, who cares? But first, I want to say I read Facebook the last few days. I was in Alabama on Dauphin Island watching the birds that are starting to arrive. How many birders are there in the room? Okay, great. And I was so struck by the history. I was born in 1962, and he started to think 1958. He said, Eisenhower. Right, I wasn't even born yet. And Eisenhower was talking about this problem. And you got to get this book. I'm taking it back to Vermont. I'm going to use it in my classroom immediately. I'd like to make a chart showing every president since then who has talked about climate change and what we need to do about it in some form or another. Even Reagan didn't say that it didn't exist. Put those quotes on one side and put the quote of the crazy lunatic we have in the White House right now on the other side, just like one quote, because he's the only one. So I'm so honored to be on stage with you, and thank you for helping me with the teaching I plan to do. And then Mark's work inspired my book. He predicted what was going to happen with Katrina, and I read his stories when I lived here. So to get to Mark, to get to your question, this is how did I go from investigative human rights journalist to birder? I still think of myself as a journalist. It's just that now I don't just interview people, Homo sapiens, I interview the birds. And I go and consult them when I am distressed or when I don't know what to do next. Because for 18 years now that I've been birding, since Katrina, they always have an answer. And I'll tell you a little story about that in a minute. That involves chickadees. You don't have chickadees here, do you? You do, okay, all right, chickadees. It's a chickadee story. But how did this happen? Well, sitting in the audience, we have Allison Plyer, who's one of my sheroes. She's the director of the data center here. We were roommates in Guatemala a million years ago when I was a human rights journalist. And after that, I moved back to Alabama to work at the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate crimes researcher. So after 10 years in Central America and then a few years in the Deep South, studying neo-Nazi groups and white supremacist groups, I was starting to lose my marbles just a little bit. And Allison could probably attest to that. So I needed to make a change, but I didn't know how to make that change or what I could do. And I'm deeply devoted to journalism, and I loved teaching. A job teaching here at Loyola, teaching journalism. So you'll understand this because you're New Orleanian. So my husband and I moved here on August 1st, 2005. Yes, I know. You laugh. That's good. Other people just look at me like I'm crazy. Why does that mean something? It means something. We moved to Lakeview, which is a beautiful place because, of course, it has a lake view, right? Which is great until a Category 5 hurricane or Category 3 or whatever it was comes along. So we had been there, I think, 29 days. Allison came to the first crab cake party we had. I remember the night before we evacuated, she called me, it was a Friday night, and asked if I wanted to go Cuban dancing with her. And I thought, well, that would be really fun. I love Cuban dancing, but isn't there like this hurricane coming, Allison? I mean, like, should we be packing our bags or what is going on, right? So you all know what happened. And that's how I went from human rights investigative journalist to birder. Because like all of you, I was flattened Well, you all weren't flattened. You were dragging your refrigerators out into the street and rebuilding your city. I was so inspired. I was flattened. I was so inspired by what I saw here in New Orleans when I moved back after Katrina to teach at Loyola, that first unforgettable and beautiful first post-Katrina semester. So the birds, it was accidental, Mark. I came back to teach journalism. I was a mess. Because of Allison, I was able to come back. You would not be holding this book, if you buy the book, if it were not for a friend who helped me find a room here to rent because our house had to be bulldozed. So small things are very, very big things when you help someone when they're in distress. And so she had a friend who didn't know me from Adam and took me into her home. Thank you, Alice Ann, wherever you are. And that's why I could come back, and that's why you're going to read the story. And it was in the backyard of Alice Ann in another neighborhood that hadn't flooded. The neighborhood, the backyard was kind of trashed. Not trashed, but because of the hurricane, right? It didn't look very nice. There was leaf litter and stuffed branches all over the place. And Alice Ann was just trying to repair her house. That I started watching the birds because I was losing it. I was walking to Loyola every day, trying to teach journalism, and I didn't even want to read the newspaper. And I'm like, how am I going to force my students to pick up the Times-Picayune every day and read all this terrible news? Does this sound familiar? Is this happening to you right now? Right. So I couldn't do it. I mean, beside the bed, there were piles of Times-Picayunes just piling up. Your stories, I'm sorry. I'd go home at night. I think, I'm going to read that. I'm going to read the whole thing today so I can talk about it tomorrow. Nope, there was another one. It just kept piling up. And so I thought, I'm a failure. I can't teach journalism if I don't read the news, and I need help. It just so happened at that very same time, right after Katrina, my dad was in California. This is all in the story. And who have older parents, when they start to get sick, this happens to all of us, right? How do you deal with it? So right after Katrina, boom, 40 days later, the same day, I finally got to see what was left of our home. My mom called me on the cell phone and told me my dad had stage 4 stomach cancer. And I had to rush to California. He had his stomach taken out, and he lived just barely that year. And the one thing my dad did, every time I went to California to visit him, he was an Irishman. Both my parents were from Ireland. And he grew up on a farm. He didn't study biology, but he loved the birds in his California yard, and he loved the hummingbirds. Has anybody seen a hummingbird yet here? Yes, the first one came back to Dauphin Island a few days ago, so they're coming back. So I go to visit my dad in California, and he was going through chemo, and he was getting sicker and sicker. He was disappearing before our very eyes. Stomach cancer is very cruel. I knew he had only months to live, but he wanted to do the chemo. So I sat with him, and what we did was sit at the window and watch the birds coming to the hummingbird feeder. And he loved it so much, and I sat there and I thought, I always thought this birding thing was really weird, and it was for old people and people who had nothing to do. I'm sorry for that stereotype. I apologize. Allison can contest, I never looked at a bird in Central America. I could have cared less about birds. But as I sat there with my father, I realized he's dying, but he's still taking care of something. He's helping some other creature live, and those creatures are giving him joy. And he can sit and watch the birds. And I came back to New Orleans to teach, and I thought, you know what? Maybe I need to watch birds. And I went to a hardware store, bought 2 feeders, set them up in Alice Ann's backyard, set them along the fence, and the house sparrows started to come. And every morning before I went to teach at Loyola, I went and sat on her back stoop with a cup of coffee, and I got my bird fix for about a half an hour. And that's how I started to crawl out of a hole. And then I realized, oh my God, this feels great. I don't have to take pills. I'm starting to get better. I thought, I have to do this all the time for the rest of my life, every day, or I'll go off the rails. So I went back to school. I got a PhD. I'm an ornithologist, and I teach birding. That's how it happened.
So let's move to Madison now. In Wisconsin, your work included activism, helping develop an NGO supporting a park, and that combined with education of university and public school students. Have you thought about how this process might be useful in addressing concerns being raised by various Trump administration attacks on environment and climate change?
I think about it all the time. I think we're all thinking about it, right? What are we going to do to get through the next 4 years and save everything that we can and everything we love? So a little background on that story. So my husband and I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, so I could get a PhD at the Gaylord Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies. Fabulous, fabulous place. I was so lucky to get a PhD in Madison. Quite by accident, well, it was because it was the only place we could afford. It was a neighborhood where the houses were cheaper. It was a lower income neighborhood. There was a beautiful park called Warner Park there. And it was a neighborhood that had some struggles with crime and some issues, but we loved it and we loved the park. And it was right across the street from our house. This park, you look out a picture frame window and there's this park. So again, I didn't know anything about ecology yet or birds, but I knew I loved them. So I started going into the park every day and walking. My husband did too, with our dogs. And I started noticing all these birds, tons and tons of birds. It's an urban park, about 200 acres, 213 acres. Half of it really built up with, tennis courts and all kinds of sports facilities, and the other half wild. So a really nice combination of different kinds of recreation, right? So I started watching the birds, and then because of that, I took an ornithology class, and then I went off the deep end. And those of you who are birders know what happens, right? You get obsessed. And I ended up finding 142 species of birds in this urban park in Madison. And it wasn't a park that was on the radar screen of Audubon or anyone. And then I found out, quite by accident too, by talking to an elderly neighbor who's a star in the book. Her name is Hetty Jacobson. She's now 94 years old. She still lives on the edge of Warner Park. And we became friends because the first morning we woke up in Madison in this very strange cold place. Never lived in a cold place, right? I was a short sleeves woman. And we moved to this very cold place. First winter, 100 inches of snow. It was like a horror movie, okay? Now I love snow, but the first winter was, oh my God. The first morning we had moved there, we wake up in a strange house in a strange place. We'd driven from Birmingham, Alabama with our dogs, freaked out, and there's a knock on the door. And I open the door, and there's this elderly German woman standing there, and she's got this pan, and it's covered with a, kitchen towel, and she says, "You have coffee pot." I'm like, what? What? And it was, she said, this is an apple coffee cake baked with apples from the trees in the park. Welcome. And she just shoved it into my hands and shuffled back across the street like she was literally wearing like a bathrobe over her pajamas or something. She wanted to make sure we had it first thing in the morning. That's how I met Hetty Jacobson, that one act of kindness. Hetty ended up becoming my park teacher because she lived on the edge of the park. Her kitchen opened to the park, and the animals came day and night to drink water, all kinds of animals, not just the birds. But I'm telling the story of Hetty to remind us all at this very difficult time that small acts of kindness and building relationship, like baking something for a stranger or a new neighbor, can be life-changing. If Hetty hadn't come over and done that the first day, I immediately realized, and as someone, a Katrina evacuee, you can relate to this is a safe place. This is a good place. People are going to be good to us here. This is a sign. I grew up Catholic, okay? Takes a long time to get over that. A sign, right? I call that chapter Our Lady of the Applesauce. That's Hetty Jacobson. So because of Hetty, one day Hetty said to me, "So you love this park and you know the birds and you study ecology. Why do you think they want to put a sidewalk through the meadow?" And I said, a sidewalk through the meadow? Who wants to do that, Hetty? And she said, oh, well, I used to go to all those city meetings, but I'm too old now. I'm scared of falling down at night in the winter. So I heard somebody talking about it. Could you go to a meeting and find out about it? And I thought, I don't want to go to some boring meeting and sit there, and who cares about a sidewalk? The book is a result of going to that meeting, and it turned into 5 years of meetings, over 150 hours of public meetings, 50,000 words of testimony on my part and my husband and the group we formed. So you mentioned it was an NGO. It's not really an NGO. It's a local environmental defense group called Wild Warner, made up of neighbors, and it's still going strong. So in the age of Trump, I think of Wild Warner and how we got started, and we decided that the first thing we would do at every meeting was, afterwards, we would go have beer and pizza. Very important, right? And New Orleanians, you get that. You get the party part. The Northerners don't really get it. It's a struggle. It's a struggle. I always think about living here because that helps me. So after we go out and we would get to know each other, but before the beginning of the meeting, we would start by sharing animal stories. What we had seen, or bird stories, or flowers, or insects, whatever it was, sharing what we were excited about in the park. Not talking about the problems, not talking about the fights. This was so intentional. First, the joy, right? Like, eat your chocolate cake first, and eat the rest of the meal. That's kind of my attitude, and I think we need a lot more joy in the movement that we are building. And we could learn a lot about geese in terms of this political moment too. Because when they fly in a V, you know, right, they're saving energy. They're saving about a third of their energy. Aviation engineers know this. Not only that, the leader drops back. They do not keep that same lead goose. And I have my students who work with kids teaching about birds. I make them run. We run in V formations to try to be like geese. And it sounds easy. And then my first thing my students learn is, my college students, this is not easy. If that lead goose is going to go back, it has to communicate. And that's why they're up there honking all the time, right? So my students have to communicate while they're running around a massive field trying to keep a V formation and then switch off. And it's kind of fun. So if you want to train yourself politically, I suggest geese V formations.
So how can your teaching methods be used in Louisiana schools, colleges, to address similar environmental issues, and where would you start?
Well, I think this is an ideal place to do it. First of all, you have fantastic birds. I mean, this is a bird paradise. The black-bellied whistling ducks, I've really been enjoying them. They were in Dauphin Island. They are so beautiful, so cool, and I know they're in Audubon Park. You have fantastic birds, and you have really muscular, I'm sure they're still here, environmental groups. I mean, people like yourself who fought to build up the levees and who've campaigned. So you have very experienced organizers here. I think you're in a very good position to do it. It's a question of relationships, right? Organizing of any kind is all about the human relationships. And I think people here do relationships better than people in other places. So I would be surprised if you didn't already have similar programs here. Mark, I would be very surprised.
Okay. Can you guys talk a little bit about how your work has a way of melding together? Is there?
Well, let me take a swing at that. I think the books, although they on the surface are very different, are very similar. And some of you may be familiar with Bill McKibben. He wrote a book in, I think, 1988. He's in my book, called The End of Nature. And that's kind of what we're dealing with. And one of the things that Trish got into on the geese, I am not a biological scientist, so the term murmuration was new to me. If you don't know what that means, you have to read her book. But these animals are very, very smart. And so when I was reading her book, which I highly recommend, something in my book sort of stood out. There's a guy named Jesse Osabal, which I doubt anybody in this room has ever heard of, but he's one of the behind-the-scenes figures in the study of climate change. He's a staffer at the National Academy of Sciences. He's received awards for what he's done for climate change. I was able to find a film in 1992 with John Sununu, the chief of staff for President Bush, first President Bush, who was the leading opponent of climate change and one of the most effective people in history in blocking climate change. But there were also top economists, scientists on all sides of the argument. So they didn't know this was going to be public, but I found a film of the meeting. So Osabel made what I call the novel argument that the climate risk was declining. He argued, quote, social vulnerability is lessening because the importance of climate has been diminishing. Because climate was mainly important for what goes on outdoors. So since the share of outdoor activities in the gross national product was declining, susceptibility to climate change will be much smaller than it is today. His logic resembled an earlier assertion that if humans stayed indoors or used better sunscreens, they shouldn't need to worry about the destruction of the ozone layer. Now, it took a lot of digging to find this film. I thought, we have the smoking gun. This shows that they are willing to accept a destruction of nature, bird life, and everything else that we automatically think is very valuable and should be preserved. But we have to understand there are a lot of people that have PhDs in economics that are brilliant coders of artificial intelligence who could care less about nature. And so this Osabel thing struck me as kind of the link between what I'm talking about and whether Trish has enough time to educate the younger generation that, yes, indeed, nature is important. I read it to her beforehand because I thought it would make her mad, this comment, and she got pretty mad when she heard it.
So Trish, can you talk about one or two of your success stories, students who have gone on from doing your action plan to moving out into the community?
Sure. One of them is organizing Tesla protests. Really great job doing research on energy all over the world, renewable energy. The Tesla protests are in her spare time. I just want to say something about what Jay just said. I think that quote is so, so important. And I think it also has to do with the news that Trump would like to make Canada the 51st state. I think instead Canada should make us their 11th province. About half my Irish family lives in Toronto. My cousins are not very happy with us right now. And then also Greenland. Where is this coming from? I think you've hit the nail on the head that rich people, very wealthy people, some of them, these people, do not care about the rest of us or the birds or the planet because they're going to go elsewhere. Elon's already going to Mars with all his 12 children and whatever, how many grandchildren he plans to have. He's a neonatalist, part of that movement. And then Trump with Greenland and Canada. Why go further north? And if you look in the New York Times, there's been stories about wealthy people from Texas and southern states, very, very wealthy, buying land in the north and in Vermont too, and driving land prices up. So why? They know climate change is happening and they're preparing and they have the resources to do so. So there's something really criminal about this. But that makes going outside and watching birds and documenting all the life around us a revolutionary act, an act of joyful resistance. And no, I don't have time to educate the next generation, Jay, but I don't have to. They already know, and they are out there working. And I have hundreds of former mentors whom I've educated working across the country as journalists, as lawyers, as garden program coordinators, as teachers in schools, and activists of all kinds. And any of you who teach, or professors here, and the students from the universities, I mean, we're everywhere. So this movement is building very fast, very fast. Think how fast, just a couple of months. It's across the country. It's going to be across the world tomorrow. So I see that success in citizenship, that my students are muscular citizens, not just voting every 4 years. It's about so much more than that. And it's about a kind of a fierce love for your place. And I think if anybody understands a fierce love for place and a muscular hope, it's you all right here in New Orleans.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. So the levers of power in our system are what we call swing districts. There are not very many of them, but they're districts that could go either direction. We have so gerrymandered the political system. So like in Louisiana, we do not have any swing districts. So we're kind of out of that ball game. So what could we do? Well, in New Orleans, our electric utility is governed by the City Council, which acts as the Public Service Commission. And they're currently considering a document about where it should go in the future. Is anyone in the room paying any attention to that? Okay. So you understand that that's one lever of power. And to simplify it, I'm a former professor, and I try to look at every side of things, and I'm not one-sided. For instance, I have defended, and this will get me in trouble with everybody in the room at times, fracking, because fracking enabled gas to replace coal. And I don't care what the scientists at Cornell say. Gas is better than coal. So, and I was the first person to testify before Congress in 2000 that natural gas was cheaper than coal. It was a revolution to everybody. But we've passed that stage. We should not be building natural gas plants in the immediate future because solar is not what it was in 2000. We sort of passed the inflection point in about 2017. And so, like next year, over 4/5 of the new capacity coming on nationally is solar. It's not just solar panels. It's the batteries of the farms. They can react to changes in the grid in 1 second. And EIA, if you go to the Energy Information Administration, there's 2 big dots in the United States where people are not planning to go solar. One of them's Louisiana. You have some power over that. So the natural gas industry said, we can adjust in 10 minutes, but they don't mention that a battery can do it in 1 second. And this improves the whole reliability and economics of the grid. And you combine that with the new control systems that are coming along, we're not just talking about solar energy. So would you be able to go to your member of the city council and explain with a little bit of sophistication what today's solar power is and why it's better than natural gas? Do you know who to call? Do you know what the process is that's going on? And I see Mark may have to put the hammer down on us here.
I want to thank both of you very much for talking to us. This has been a great morning. I really appreciate it.